Hello, welcome to MNA's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve MNA as the Director of Ecosystems Development. We are all assessors. We all make judgments. We size people up. Obviously, it can be done for less than noble purposes, but when done rightly, it helps us navigate our lives. We are all assessed. We wouldn't be in the jobs that we are or the relationships we are now in unless there was some degree of assessment. Some assessments are formal, others are informal. Some can be just gut feelings. I am myself glad that a new little blonde girl in my sixth grade class didn't go with her initial assessment of me as an 11-year-old stuttering little kid. It took 49 years and we're still together. It actually took her about 10 years of assessing till she finally said yes to marry me. Now, when it comes to church planting, we've been assessing planters for years. And in God's providence, the PCA has, I would have to say, developed a really great assessing tool that we have called the Assessment Center. Most of our church planters have gone through it, and I trust have benefited from both its rigor and grace that flows together and culminates in a lot of work, but culminates in those few days. Yet, the assessment that we do is but really one snapshot, one picture in a long line of examinations, considerations of our fitness and to pursue one call or another. Well, today we are going to be talking about assessment, starting with how we historically have used that term here in MNA. We want to hear what to expect out of the process if you're considering church planting. But then we're going to want to walk back from that formal one point to talk about how we can consider assessing in the context of seminary campuses and even on all forms of pastoral preparation. As in life, assessment is a process. How we think about it is extremely important. And so with us today, to be able to introduce our panel here, I'm glad to have with us Paul Hahn, coordinator of MNA, who himself went through assessment you said 94, almost 25 years ago. Paul has been planted a couple churches and himself has been an assessor. Jim Hatch, Director of Church Planter Development for MNA, has been a vital part of the MNA machine and has been feeding potential planters into our system. He has overseen church planting Readiness seminar, which has been held on numerous seminary campuses. Steve Resch, pastor of Walnut Creek Presbyterian Church, has served as the coordinator of assessment up until recently, which means he's done a whole wide range of work throughout this process and can speak well to it. Robert Kim is the assistant professor of applied theology and church planting, the Philip and Rebecca Douglas Chair of Church Planting and Christian Formation, which is far more than you can put on any business card, I can imagine. And of course, he has served as an assessor, but he's also right now giving attention to how we might assess earlier in this whole process. And then, of course, we have Mary Ellen Gafarlio. She is our assessment process would come to a crouching halt if Emmy was not in the driver's seat. Imagining to organize and administrate a bunch of stray cats that make up our assessors, who themselves were often planters, and the potential planters who apply to takes a lot of skill, rarely seen on the face of the earth. Well, before we really jump into it, we'll want to get off by start by saying this is a conversation among not just the six of us, but all of you who are with us on here on the Zoom call. I see the Facebook is not going live for some reason, so it will be just us on this, but you've got the chat box and the Q&A box. Really want to encourage you, send us some questions, we'll pick them up, but to really get us started, I'm going to kind of start us off with just a few questions. I want to talk a little bit about kind of our background and our history. And Paul, as coordinator, would you give us a little brief background and history when we talk about assessment? What has that meant historically? And Jim, you've got a lot of great institutional knowledge there as well. Jump in. But Paul, would you give us a little bit of background, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, so much for having us on today. Thanks for all who are listening in live here or check it out later on in the recording. Jim was actually the acting coordinator of MNA in 1994 when Fran and I went through an assessment process. So he knows way more about this than I do, as does Steve and Mary Ellen, and Robert's been an assessor forever. So, but I'll give my side of things. Really, we know this current format for assessing, what we call the assessment center, has been around for about 35 years, since the mid to late 80s. We've seen some 1,700 people go through the process of assessment in its current form. Alan Thompson was really the primary architect and originator of this whole process getting going, who did that in a consulting role and then came on staff with MNA. Before this current mode of doing assessment, we sent people just out with a wave and a prayer, and we had very mixed results. 50% or below stayed in the field. Sometimes I've heard numbers reported in the early days as low as a third to a quarter of the plants staying in business. So since then, we have, since this era of this 30 plus years, we've done different studies. At one point early on, we saw 90% of those who went through the assessment staying in the field, their churches either particularizing or on a path to particularization, and going forward in a healthy way. I would say that number has dropped some as more time has gone on. We're in the process of trying to do more direct study on that. One of our goals in M&A going forward is to have more hard data. But I would say somewhere around between 3/4 and 2/3 have stayed, have particularized, are going forward. So a massive growth since doing this assessment process. So Jim, what would you add to that?
I think you've covered that well, Paul. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good.
Well, good. Yeah. Look, I guess, Paul, you gave us a little bit of background, why we do assessments. So we've seen some success in the numbers in that. How has assessment been viewed historically? Is there, times I've heard people say, why are we doing this? I mean, if they've been ordained or called to ministry, are we importing something here that we shouldn't even be considering?
Yeah, now that's a great question. I know, Fran and I went through assessment to go out to Austin, Texas in 1994. And I remember hearing the things back in the early 90s, assessment is really rough and it may not be a biblical construct. And I remember all those things, and our experience was just so wonderful. We'd been in campus ministry with RUF. Fran was actually pregnant and due with our third child the week when assessment was offered, when only 1 or 2 were offered a year. And so a micro personal assessment was offered for us at that time. John Smed was the coordinator there at that time of church planning. Marilyn and Alan Thompson were a part of that. John Thomas was a part of that. And our experience was wonderful. And I think, where we've really moved in this is, I think in the early days of assessment, we sort of were hammers that hit one kind of nail. You need to be very attractional. You need to be a very dynamic kind of leader. You need to be high D&I. You need to be a super magnetic personality. You need to be kind of this winsome A+ kind of preacher. And you need to be this super evangelist. And those are the people we're going to send out. And there just aren't many of those. I'm not sure there are any of those really with that kind of total package. B, what we've really grown to over time is realizing that there are all kinds of people called by God to go out and plant with all kinds of ranges of gifts, and they will have different strengths and weaknesses that they will build their teams around, of launch groups and leaders and then staff, Lord willing. And so there are all kinds of ways to go about that. I think if you're a part of an assessment now, both as an assessor or especially as a candidate, I think you would find there's a tremendous prayerfulness about it. There's a tremendous sense that we want to just be part. We're not bringing something down from Sinai that says yes or no, there's a gate here on the right or the left, but rather giving input from out of experience, a wealth of experience in a church planner assessment team who has prayed over these couples or these individuals and saying, Lord, how can we give an advice and encouragement in a sense of direction to go forward, in a sense of best practices to develop in the areas of weakness or areas that just need more practice and development. So I think we've gone huge. And as you said in the intro, just briefly, you said we're always doing assessing. So we're not a calling agency. We're not telling presbyteries what they can or can't do. That's not at all what this is about, but rather giving advice to candidates and to those who may be sending them to say, this is what we see. And this is part of your input in assessing what God is laying on the hearts in terms of calling. So
good. Let's talk a little bit about process and what to expect in the process. So Mary Ellen, as the administrator,
the czar, yes.
The czar, yes, without
Yeah.
whom we would all be wallowing in the muck and mire. So, hey, I think I should be a church planter. So give me the dates. I'll show up at those dates, and you can tell me what a wonderful person I am. I may not be attractive, but hopefully I'm attractional in my lifestyle. So what happens when I contact and say I want to go through assessment? What would I expect to hear from you, and what that process looks like? And then we'll talk, Steve. Then I want you to talk about once I get there, what does it look like?
There's several steps to happen before you come to assessment, and we have purposely put in gates for your protection. We will never sacrifice you or your family on the altar of church planting. It's not worth it. So you do an informational phone call with me. I give you some data, and there's a couple gates in place there. And if you pass those gates, then we send you on to a qualified pre-screener who will interview you and ask you about your call to church planting and a whole bunch of other questions. And then that pre-screener will either recommend you to have an application or not. And if you do receive an application, then you have a bunch of things to do in a timely manner and get them to me. And then your file will go to a review team who will then invite you to assessment or not. So that's the basics of it.
So a bunch of things. Can I knock this out in a half hour?
Oh, nay. We recommend a 2-week lead up to when your application is due. There's a lot of things that have to happen. You have to do several profiles. You have 6 references that are doing profiles for you. You're taking
and the spouse. It's not.
Yes.
If you're married, it's both the husband and the wife.
Okay.
Yes, you are a team. You are planting together as a team. So you'll be doing everything together, the same amount of items.
Okay. So and during that time, let's say I'm an assistant pastor at a church. I'm considering this, but it's not like I'm announcing what my intentions are for job security's sake. Let's say, do other people know I'm in this process outside of the people I give names to for the 360 evaluation?
For the references.
Yeah, for references, obviously.
No, it is completely confidential. I actually can't release any information unless I have your signature, and it goes into a vault, basically. No, it is completely confidential. Even at assessment, there's no pictures that are allowed. Many people are coming in under the radar and want to keep it that way for various reasons. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there's some anonymity there. So, okay. Believe it or not, the review team had said, yes, Vogel, you can come. And we're not going to use you as the negative example, but yeah, you're going to show up. And all this conversation takes me back. I went almost 30 years ago, and Jim, you and Jan were among my assessors. We were both just 15, 16 years old at that time, but that's a whole nother story. So Steve, I show up. You've run a number of assessments, overseen the process. What should I expect? Are there any dark rooms with bright lights or electrical wires, and clubs that you're going to beat me with? What does that whole experience look like?
Well, I share with people that there be usually three different types of folks that come. First of all, there is a third of the candidates that have come to get their ticket punched. They have the calling, the character, and the competencies that's been affirmed by others in their presbytery or a church planting network or denomination, because we do assess some that aren't in the PCA as well. And they're there to get the final okay before they launch into church planting. So their bags are packed. They're on the train station and they need their ticket punched. And oftentimes that is because many presbyteries or networks rely on the assessment center's feedback for funding. So some of those, a third of the people are very confident, know exactly what's going on, and they're ready to go. There's another third that with that calling, character, and competencies, they may not be sure on one or two of those. For instance, they may think they have the calling to do this. They might have some of the character competencies, but they don't know where. They don't know where the Lord might put them to actually plant a church. So they're going for some more feedback. Maybe they have been to seminary, maybe been a part of RUF or another campus parachurch ministry, and might need some help in determining the final factors. So they have a few questions that they would like some wisdom and perspective from the assessment center. That's another third. The last third are folks that are there purely on an investigation, exploratory mission. They're not sure if they have any of it. They're there for direction that might help them in their ministry future, and they are attracted to church planting, but they're not sure they have the calling, the character, or the competencies, and are purely looking for the feedback of the assessors and the assessment center to guide them for their future ministry endeavors. So there's three different kinds of people that come. When you show up, as Mary Ellen had said, you've already done a lot of homework. You've turned in a lot of diagnostics that we require, things like a DISC profile, a 16 PF, which is a 16 personality factors that we use for a marriage. You will have had or will have a counseling session during the time that you're there, or previously scheduled Zoom distance counseling session with a licensed counselor, and that will be done for the couple if you're married. There's the 360 review called the Church Leader Inventory and the Church Leader Spouse Inventory, which requires 6 references. So we have had lots of diagnostics and feedback from you, but when you come, we will be doing some combination of some individual presentations that you will do. You will preach for 10 minutes. You and your spouse will share your call presentation for 10 minutes. There are some group exercises that we do that where the assessors can observe you in certain situations. And yes, we intentionally make you a bit uncomfortable because, true character comes out in stress and competition. What's the whole basis of Christian camping? Well, you put some kids in some stressful situations, outbound, zip lines, other things, because then you have an opportunity to observe them and who they really are, so that you see how they are and can affirm and speak into their life, as well as just gather more information and feedback about who they are and how they operate. We have a lot of meals together, which you eat with the assessors, and it's a great time to just catch up with each other and learn about each other, and all that while the assessors are observing and they're asking questions, but we're also having a very enjoyable time. The assessment center and the assessors are not the Holy Spirit. That's a good thing. But they are very gracious former church planters who really love Jesus, and they love people who are involved in ministry, and especially the ministry of church planters. We are there not to assess your fitness for ministry. We are there to simply assess your fitness for church planting, which is a very specialized kind of pastoring. And that's what we're there for.
Thank you.
Can I just make a quick observation? I've noticed through the years that a lot of couples coming to assessment, well, some don't come out of fear. And some come full of fear, especially the wife. And part of that is because in many cases, the assessment is going to provide for them maybe the very first time that a group of Christians in the body have ever given them the affirmation and the critique that they need. Sometimes in our Christian communities, we are not very good at lovingly helping each other know how to grow. And that can lead to a lot of fear of being evaluated. Sure, it's tricky. And but it's a wonderful experience of maybe for the first time, folks experiencing people who love them enough to tell them the truth, to both affirm and also evaluate how they could grow.
Yeah, it's a 360 review saturated in grace.
Yeah.
And it is a beautiful experience too.
It's the kind of thing we need more of in the body generally.
Yes. Yes.
I went to assessment back in the day, kicking and screaming, and ended up coming out loving it the most. And now working behind the scenes with these assessors, they are for you. All the assessors are for you. They want you to succeed. They want to love on you, and they come with good pastoral hearts.
Mary Ellen, what was it that, why were you kicking and screaming?
Selfishness. I gotta leave my job. I gotta leave my kids. You know, these people, the bigger deal was these people are going to pick my life apart and tell me where I'm sinning. And I don't want to hear that. But I will say that they nailed me to a T, but it was encouraging. And I came out saying, yeah, we can do this. We can plant a church. And the assessors really have great pastoral hearts, the men and the women. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there.
I think that's a good point to make, that the assessor team is male and female, usually pretty equally balanced in numbers for folks. And then what to expect at the end. We take all the data, all the diagnostics, a large family interview, all the things that you have given to us and the things that we have observed and asked you, and we put it into a final assessment summary that not only has all your diagnostic scores, but it has the strengths and some of the weaknesses and recommendations that we have for you at the end of the assessment center. This is not a pass-fail situation. You don't get graded A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. We only make recommendations, and then the sending agencies for church planting actually make the final decision. MNA doesn't plant churches. Presbyterian churches plant churches, or networks plant churches. And so we make our recommendations based
Steve,
on
I think that's
the
important.
experience we've had.
That's important to remind folks is that the assessment center has no authority. MNA has no authority. It's all recommendations to the couple or to the presbytery or to the sending church.
Mm-hmm. There was a question asked a bit earlier, but I think it's pertinent here regarding Abraham Lee asked, can you give an example regarding the diversity you're talking about? So how would you address that issue as far as the assessment goes? So I'm coming, perhaps I'm not majority culture, and I look at the PCA and go, pretty much white, upper middle class or middle class, and I'm not going to fit in that rubric. What might I expect in that context from the assessment?
Well, I can address.
Well, let me actually bring some clarity. I think that question was asked when
Oh,
Paul was speaking,
okay,
specifically
please.
about the types of leaders that we were assessing, that before it was predominantly D's and I's, and that we're looking for a more diverse body of church leadership. I think it can
Not just
pertain,
the type A.
exactly. I think that can pertain to race and ethnicity,
Okay.
but I think that question itself was trying to get to what diversity are we
Okay.
seeing of church planters that are coming out that are different as well.
Okay. Oh, wait, let's talk about that part.
Go ahead, Robert.
Robert,
Let you
yeah.
talk to that. Go ahead.
Sure. I'll just reference by saying, I think, yeah, typically speaking, even as we look at other networks, there are places in which people have said, yeah, it's the D's and I's, it's the quintessential, let's say the Apostle Paul mindset of church planting. But if we do, for example, many of you might be aware of like this church planting spectrum or continuum, as we call it. Those are less than 5% of people that are out there that would really fit that bill. And so if our mindset was those are the only people we're going after, our rate of church planting won't be nearly enough to be able to keep up with population growth and the missional need that's out there. So the reality is that we're going to have people that fit more in that pastor, pastor realm of things where we find to be a sweet spot. And just to kind of even say, S's and C's can plant churches, they will just plant different types of churches. And so learning how to be comfortable as God has fashioned you, and then going off of what Steve has mentioned in terms of the things that we're getting after, which is, character, competency, calling, do you still have enough of the raw DNA outside of the things that beyond kind of personality type or your DISC assessment to be able to say that the types of churches that are out there we need, and then specifically with race and ethnicity, if I can just speak to that a little bit, we need to be better at that. The reality is that, in 2045 census data will say that the US will become a majority minority nation. And so as we think about the nations that are present before us, that is going to be it. And so there's a lot of populations that are simply not represented, not just in the PCA, but just as a whole in terms of evangelical churches in North America, by which, asking ourselves the questions as we think about the harvest that's plentiful, the workers that we need moving forward need to have a high level of cultural competence to be able to bridge across those cultures, to be able to see our churches reflective of Revelation 7:9, right? Every nation, tribe, and tongue. And so I think that's our hope and our prayers that we would get at that as well.
Robert, that's so good. And I would just riff off of that a little bit. Robert actually sent to a group of us recently something that came out of the Send Institute, Daniel Yang and others, talking about, which is a macro group of evangelical leaders in church planting movements across the whole spectrum of evangelicalism. That's sort of what the Send Institute is made up of. And they've written a manifesto, and maybe, Robert, you could post it in the chat box there. They're sort of saying, hey, we've got to wake up to having to need a greater diversity in the kinds of churches we're planting, with a greater diversity of kinds of people planting them, not just in terms of ethnicities or backgrounds, but in terms of giftings. And especially there's going to have to be a shift. I mean, when we were coming through Chris Vogel, Steve, probably down to Steve Resch, it was, how can you be this great attractional leader? How can you be the kind of person that gets people inside the church doors? And now I think it is, are you the kind of leader who can gather a team, a launch group or a team, around having an apostolic presence in a place for witness, for prayer, for discipleship of new converts, through probably tent making in a place? And does a church spring up out of that? So I think that's where we're heading. We're not looking for the same kinds of, we're not looking necessarily for a bunch of Tim Kellers anymore, not that we could ever find them anyway, right? But, I think we're even, the situation is changing in terms of what the needs are in church planting. So
when we're talking about that character, calling, character, and the competence, that competence is much broader than we probably imagine if we're on the front end looking at what it means to be a church planter and what the reality is. It's perhaps broader than we sometimes realize or recognize. So we sometimes self-assess ourselves out of being assessed. I've already made the decision. I'm not like that person as a planter.
In fact,
go ahead, Jim.
In fact, I was one who would have never, I'm not a Randy Pope or a Tim Keller, and I would have never been able to do a scratch plant. I ended up planting with a core group of about 30 people with a couple of elders and deacons. And for me, that was the perfect, and the Faith Church in Montgomery, Alabama ended up with about 140 people when I left. And that was exactly the kind of church that God enabled Jim Hatch to see planted.
I think speaking to the diversity issue, there's also the diversity of kinds of churches to be planted. There are city center churches, there are suburban churches, there are mid-sized town churches, there are rural, small town churches to be planted. And those all take different kinds of planters.
Campus churches,
perhaps
right?
at different kinds of competencies or emphases in their giftedness. It's one thing to plant in a city center church where you may need to be more aesthetically on point, as opposed to a rural church where your best networking is kicking dirt with farmers. And there's a lot of different kinds of churches that need to be planted that takes all kinds of different kinds of planters, and we can assess for all of them.
It's really good, Steve.
So I go through assessment. So what do I expect at the end? What happens? Are they going to assign me a place? Are they going to say, get out of here, we never want to see you again? Why are you in this denomination? What might I expect as we come through this process? And more specifically in the kind of recommendations and such.
Well, we will specifically give a final assessment summary that includes all the results of the diagnostics, and includes the strengths and weaknesses that the assessors all, in a unanimous way, write up. It will give you a final assessment rating, and there are different kinds of ratings. You may be recommended, you may not be recommended. You may have certain intermediate steps of recommendation that says you're close, but you're not there. We call that a potentially recommended. If we could use a baseball analogy, since we're now in the World Series, as a church planner, we're looking for major league players, but you might be a AAA player, a full professional baseball player, but you might have trouble with the curve and hitting the cutoff man, and you might need a year or two in an apprentice situation, or a place that a church that is going to give you some of the opportunities to bolster some of those ministry experiences that you need before that your sending agency would feel comfortable in releasing you as a full-fledged church planter.
Okay. Good. Any other thoughts with?
Another thing. The assessment center it's an assessment center. We're not a placement office.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, we can make some recommendations and say, you would do really well in a major metropolitan area. Or we could say, you're probably best suited to be in a big fish in a small pond. And that would be okay too.
A lot of times organic connections can come out of it, where, if you're part of the assessment team as an assessor, you see this couple and they're not necessarily headed anywhere directly coming in. And so there can be these kind of organic connections that say, we really want to help you make a bridge here or there, or want to help you introduce to this network or this region. Let me help you connect with some people in this presbytery or this, so it can happen organically, but there isn't per se a placement office. I think the best thing that happens on the back end is you'll get an exit interview, and it'll be with two of the people, in most cases that you've maybe felt a close connection with during the week, a man and a woman who sit with you and sort of help you process as husband and wife if you're a couple, or as an individual single male planner if that's where you come into the process with, and help you process it together if you're a husband and wife. How do you process together? What does this mean for you together? We had a great question come in from the audience just about, what about my wife? How should we talk about this whole process together? What's expected of her? Mary Ellen, why don't you would you take that one to start with, and maybe we can come around you a little bit on that one?
Sure, but before I answer that, let me circle back to
Please.
assessment.
Yeah.
Alan Foster follows up with every single candidate and helps them through the process. There was a question here about what happens if you have a provisional rating. Alan will help you and work with you with concerns that the assessment team has had, and just try to move you along and direct you to who could help you. Fred Marsh always follows up about fundraising. I follow up with you with 4 additional emails that gives you all kinds of information about church planting. There's just a never ending cycle of follow up with you after assessment, but we are not a placement center.
That's really good, Mary Ellen. That's very good.
And then
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Chris.
No. You follow up with the perspective of the wife.
From the way, you are a team, and there's follow up as well for the wife. Parakaleo is an awesome resource to help women after they're called to church planting with their husband to navigate the waters of that. They even encourage that the church plant puts in the budget for coaching for the woman, because the wife should have a coach and the husband should have a coach. So you put that right in your budget from the beginning, and it's never a question. We give you that information at assessment, and then also again at follow-up for assessment. That's about it.
Yeah. We want to begin to make some shifts here as well. So we've been talking about the assessment and what we've been doing, the assessment center, which that right now, how long does that take? What would I expect? How many days? Steve?
3 days.
3 days?
In-person assessment that is usually 6 to 12 or 14 couples
Okay.
or singles. It's a 3-day in-person,
Okay.
which we will be doing our first in-person assessment since COVID hit mid-November. And I think we have 8 or 9 or 10 couples that are ready to go and are willing and feel comfortable being in person. Now we'll do all the correct distancing and masking and fumigating the facility each evening when we're done. So we'll be taking all the normal PPE protocol stuff, but that's usually how many folks, and it's a 3-day process.
And again, not in 2020, but in a normal world, how many assessments do we have a year? 5?
Yeah,
We
about 5.
typically have done 5.
Yeah. Usually what? January, April, July, September, November, right?
There you go.
Yep.
Normal cadence. One of the things we've looked at doing, we mentioned we would often call it a streamline. Now we're calling it a personal assessment. What does that personal assessment look like? How is that run, Mary Ellen?
A personal assessment, we've actually had to do a lot this year because of cancellation of assessment, and we just needed to get couples through and single men through. You prepare exactly beforehand of what you would do to go to a group assessment. You've done all the profiles. Everything is exactly the same. You meet with a counselor. The difference is that it's now a 4 to 6 hour Zoom call with 3 assessors and not in a group setting in person. There's benefits to it, but in my opinion, there's more benefit to a group assessment. You're having more meals together with everybody. The camaraderie is there. We're getting to know you during the meals and everything like that. But then with a personal assessment as well, we're getting to know just you and not other couples, so our focus can be on you. So there's pros and cons to the process.
So again, in the outside of a pandemic time, So do I get to choose what kind of assessment I have? Because, you know, Marilyn, I really don't like people and I don't want to be around them at all, but I want to be a church planter. So can I do a personal assessment to avoid other humans?
Personal assessment has never been used just for the sake of expediting a couple. In the past, it's really for somebody who's already like planted a church but is coming back into the fold, or has started an RUF from scratch, or has extenuating medical problems. You know, we had a couple who had some children who were in wheelchairs, and they would have hired a nurse to come with them, and it was easier for them to be assessed personally. So we made that work for them, but it's never been just to expedite a couple.
And the final decision rests with the review committee, not with the couple. They can make their case, which obviously will.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes. After we have all this information and you go to the review team and they decide, you know, whether you should be extended an invitation or not to assessment, the review team at that point will say, this couple will do great in any assessment, you know, let them decide. Or this one's a little more green in ministry, and we really need to have them come to a group assessment to see how they are with other people, to see their preaching in person. So no, it really comes down to what the review team recommends. Okay.
Yeah. And there's a new form, and I'll just touch briefly on it because I want to be able to move to some other things about assessing as a process. You also may hear of a micro assessment, which it's not personal, it's not a group, but it's a smaller group, ideally 3 couples with 4 assessors. It would be done usually in an evening and in a full day physically together. The ideal there is if there's an issue of getting people together, it's 10 in number, it's a little bit easier, it can be done a little bit more on a regional end. It also will help us in the context of assessing if there's language issues. I mean, right now, if a person is very much strong, predominant Spanish, we would send them to Mexico for TOM, their assessment process, but to be able to do it here in our context. But to have assessors and those being assessed, being able either for language, for culture, whatever aspect, so that we can be more attentive in that kind of a context. So you'll hear more along those lines as well. Well, let's move in the time we've got left. We've been talking about assessing right before we send. And what I've been saying is it's in some ways we're not careful. If that is our point of assessment, it's a lot like a university a week before you graduate saying, oh, we forgot to test if you're to be able to get a diploma, so to speak. So we'll give you a test and yeah, good, or maybe you need another year or 2 in college. But pushing that back, not being just one picture of the person, but just like with our medical records, you know, we see tests that can be able to go back and have those files on you to see how your health is progressing or regressing. So we're beginning to talk about, okay, how do we move that back? What are our other options? Jim, you've been doing the church planting readiness seminar. I want you to talk about that. And then Robert, talk about some of the things you're doing then at Covenant to give a much more of a whole video framework of that.
Well, the Church Planting Readiness Seminar is a weekend seminar originally designed for seminary couples and singles. We take principles from the full-blown assessment center and ratchet it way, 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 way down to make it appropriate to where a seminary student or a seminary couple is. The difference is it's not a definitive evaluation. It's much more indicative. It's a tool along the way. And originally it's been held on seminary campuses, and this is expanding. So in this year in 2020, we will have had a readiness seminar on a Friday night and Saturday all day in St. Louis, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Charlotte, and Orlando. And we're in the process of trying to remake, retool, expand, export so that it's possible to do this in other places as well. How's that, Chris? You want to?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And some of it with that is we've begun recording some of these so that we can also do them more virtually, as well as an increasing number of those in pastoral formation are not at a brick and mortar and cannot as easily attend.
Right. I was going to say Robert Kim might have some good stuff on this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, I think the snapshot analogy is really good. And then even jumping off of Steve Rush's, baseball analogy of the farm system. So realizing, and actually I just spoke at a Presbyterian retreat over the weekend. And one of the things I had emphasized was, moving forward, I think raising Indigenous leaders. And so as much as we have someone like Alan Foster, who's great, who can do some placement, figuring out how do we raise our church planners even within our midst, right? And so in this particular case, it was the Oleana Presbytery, of just kind of saying more than likely, your next church planner is going to be someone that's in your church right now. It could be a college student, a youth group student, et cetera. So how do we pour into these people earlier on so that we can kind of see them grow and develop? Here at Covenant Seminary, I'll just kind of give the snapshot that we're doing is saying, yes, we want all of our students in our church planning track, for example, to get to assessment center, and Lord willing, a lot of the things that we poured into their life, that they would get there and to be able to, let's say, I don't want to use the word pass, but do well in the sense of what they have been taught and trained and equipped to do, so that when they get to assessment center, they can get out and plant churches quicker, which is our idea, is get students out and ready for the field with less debt and more equipped, so that we can see the greater planting of churches in our present context. So what we've done is we do an initial assessment, and then year over year, we use a tool right now called the Cpca, Church Planner Candidate Assessment, which is, it measures you off of 30 different competencies, pretty close to what the COI does. And we do that after the first year, second year, third year, and then by the fourth year, hopefully sending them to assessment center. So exactly what Chris was getting at, we're not saying get your X-ray at the end. You've had enough snapshots, and year over year, we're also developing learning contracts to be able to say, here are some things you can work on this year. So for example, in the past month, I've done some of the debriefs. One has been with a student to say, hey, you haven't had many preaching opportunities. This year, let's try to get 6 reps in different contexts that you can kind of get that developed now. One person was evangelism. So this person doesn't have any contact with unbelievers on a given week. And so the questions were kind of saying, how do we get you out into places in which you can kind of interact with those who are not Christian? So this person took a job at Starbucks, so that literally it's part of the fulfillment of his development to be in a place and a setting where he's intentionally engaging non-believers. And so we're trying to back design, and so if you know this phrase, like back design assessment center to a certain extent, so that they get these assessments earlier on so they can continue to be formed and developed accordingly.
Good. Yeah, if we're, keep moving that back. So we're still talking, from a very formal multi-day thing to Rob, what you're talking about is kind of an ongoing engagement. It's with some formality. What assessing can be done or should be done before that? So I'm a pastor at a church, and I got a guy, he hasn't even starting to think about seminary. Is there any even more informal, or what should we be asking them about? Talking about calling, competency, and character. So what might I as a pastor be wanting to think about, or as a ruling elder in a church, someone I'm discipling?
Here's one suggestion that I use a lot with seminary students that I think all of us as leaders could use with people under our care. I urge them to begin to do church planting kinds of things now while they're in seminary. So think through what a church planter does and urge your people, your leaders, then and evaluate them as they begin to do it. So for example, a growing walk with the Lord and a growing marriage, a growing burden for their community that results in their actually getting out in the community and finding out what makes it tick. Growing leadership in their own discipling and training of other people, growing experience of seeing lost people come to Jesus, and a growing ability to speak and teach in ways that are good for non-Christians as well as Christians. That can be done by a pastor leader of his elders. I'm struck by the fact that Book of Church Order 8:3 says that elders are supposed to be examples to the flock in how they evangelize the unconverted. Our elders could become church planters.
In addition, to answer that question, one of the best things we can do to pre-assess and put in a good church planting pipeline is to give folks in seminary or perhaps assistant pastors and staff members, give them initiatory ministry work while they're at their church, so that they're doing a microcosm church plant. They're casting vision, they're recruiting leaders and training them, they're operating within a budget, they're seeking the lost, and they have a growth and discipleship plan for the folks that are in their ministry. And if they can do that within the existing church that they're at, they're getting church planting experience, because they're starting something within the church that if it doesn't go so well, is it going to bring down the mothership? But you as a senior pastor or a session or ministry leader are able to coach them through that period of time and through their development process as they're leading a ministry within the church. That to me is, and that's what we have done historically with our church plant apprentices, and that they have to start something within our congregation, a unique ministry, so that they're getting ready to become a church planter. And then they're getting feedback and evaluation from me and others, which put them and gives us good measurables. So when they do come to the assessment center, we can ask and see the measurables are they a visionary leader? How well do they work with others? How's their conflict management? Are they gatherers? Are they doing evangelism actively? Unfortunately, a lot of assistant pastors aren't just become glorified gophers within their church to alleviate all the pressure of the senior pastor, and they can never leave the walls of their church getting all this stuff done. And that's a real disservice to leadership and church planning development.
Chris Vogel, you've done a great job on Wisconsin Network in growing your own planters and in pressing this assessment process further back. Why don't you answer your own question a little bit there, Mr. Moderator?
Yeah, no, there have been a number of things we've done here. There's a tool that we have used fairly rarely with guys who have expressed an interest in planting, so even before seminary, but definitely as they start seminary and become part of our system, and using, it's called TribeMetrics HD. It's a little bit more costly, but it's a good, it does DISC, it does present emotional kind of stability issues, as well as your areas of growth in that. So it gives us a great window so we can sit and talk with them and work with them through that process. So as guys enter into our system, that's part of it. And they are doing internships while they're going through school. We're trying not to separate them out as distinct, because I think to Robert's point, we can really then begin to measure, do you have the skills and the gifts? Because initially, not everyone, but yeah, I'll get that link to the TribeMetrics at some point. Sorry. It's about $200, and that's a 1/3 cost of the whole thing. So that's why I'm not recommending it necessarily, but we have an inside connection to it. But once they're in the process, this allows us, as they're in these mentored cohorts, for us to talk to them, because initially everyone's, I want to plant a church, and until they go do it and then realize that's hard. And so we want to give them that experience. They're also getting experiences in church plant, as an intern. Most of them are in church plants or associated with them. And again, just last year, when was that? That was last March, Jim, right? We did the Readiness seminar up here, right before everything got locked down.
But the significant thing about that was not a seminary campus.
Mm-hmm.
Here was a group of couples that had been raised out there on the hustings, as it were.
Yeah.
And we were happy to come do that, and it went very well.
Yeah.
Well, Wisconsin teaches you something that we all need to learn, and that is, when you're operating out of a sense of weakness and need in your start, i.e. you're not in a saturated presbytery in the Southeast or something with tons of churches, but you're in a place where a presbytery is starting out of weakness, it has great humility, but also great boldness and creativity to say, we've got to start this. We've got to grow our own. Because even when we bring outside people in, their goal is to become one of us and grow their own here. And so it's just, it's really huge what's going on there in some other places. And I think more and more that's going to be the model situationally for more and more of our churches and regions.
And part of that assessment too is we're not just looking for planters, because the pool has to be so much larger. Because, well, and again, I think for a lot of us, a number of folks, we didn't think starting church planting. We became an assistant, associate, and then entered into it, which is great. So my fear always is people will too early rule themselves out from church planting and won't go through assessment and then don't consider it again. That's where having a variety of assessing tools through a process to say right now, no, but yeah, you're called to the ministry. We are affirming all of that. Let's keep talking. The one tool I do think would be good, one Robert mentioned, the church planter candidate assessment. I think that's it. Cpca. It's out of Lifeway. The PCA helped them develop it, and for that reason, we do get a 2/3 discount. I think it's, Robert, what, $32 to use. It's a 360 evaluation, right, Robert? I mean, what are the components? You mentioned the disc.
Yeah, so it's pretty great. It does a 360 evaluation off of, I think, 32 different competencies that they're looking at. Some of those will differ than some of the competencies that CLI look at, but there's obviously a lot of overlap with respect to kind of the things that were done. One of the things I'll say with respect to it is the CPCA was developed, so as much as people will balk, maybe it's a Lifeway thing, it was a culminating project of a lot of different churches and denominations that wanted to pour into something as a tool that was easy, accessible, affordable to get that quick snapshot. And so, for example, more recently, I've talked with the network, just kind of saying, hey, we have a young man who's thinking about church planting, but we want to see if is it worth investing in something like an assessment center, which assessment center, I don't know the exact cost right now, but let's say well over $1,000, whereas you can kind of do this quick $32 thing as a quick metric to say, hey, this is something that we can do, presbyteries could use, and be able to at least have it doesn't have to be the final part, but at least a part. Again, think about it like
part of the video, right, Robert? It's part
exactly.
of the
Yeah. So the unfolding piece of it all, that they can kind of have access to it. And so again, it takes into account their competencies. It does look at spiritual gifts. It does this, and it even addresses things like blind spots, so that they can go ahead and try to grow as a leader.
Robert, why don't you put up where folks can get access to that?
We just did that. It's up there.
Yeah. Okay, good.
We're soon around time. Let me just show you. This is what comes out of it. This is what they send us. So this is a non-existent person. We're not really showing you anything we shouldn't show you. Is that coming up for you guys?
Yep.
And I'm going to scroll through it quickly. But here's Kevin's disc, and kind of tell you some of those things to talk him through. Kind of where are you in the context of ministry experience? And these are the talking points. This isn't final, but this gets the conversation going. Then they give a tiered report. These are the competencies that he was talking about. And again, what they're seeing is primary, secondary, tertiary. We may or may not totally agree, but on the order and the arrangement, but they're really helpful to say, you're not, this is important to be a risk taker if you're going to be a planter, and you are risk adverse. So either this will work, or you're going to learn to need to kind of soften those red lights. And then they go through all of these competencies, which, according to the baseline of 80% and 20%, where are you? So poor Kevin here, risk adverse, he is not open to change. He should be somewhere up in here if he's going to have some help. So this is an area you can begin to talk about. And then they break it down in much more detail and spell it out. And so, it goes into some spiritual gifts. That's $32, and it's readable. That's one thing I like about it. CLI is great. CLI is hard you got to get used to how to read it, interpret it.
And this does this represent a 360? They have references that
there is a 360, and we are in conversation with them to add one extra element, and that is the person who's overseeing them, that works with them, that they're discipling, that they can write in in words what are some of their strengths and weaknesses, the person they're evaluating. But yes, and so they're seeing where they see themselves at, where their evaluators or their references see themselves at, and where they're against the mean average of what has been determined. And I think once we get that personal write-in component, it will be even stronger moving into the future. Yeah. So, and that link is up there. It's again, it's Lifeway, cpca.lifeway.com. And all this will also be sent out to all the attendees. I'll get you all the links in the follow-up notes.
There are a couple of outstanding questions that we haven't addressed from.
Yeah, let's touch those,
folks. So I wanted to, Ben, you asked, is there an ideal season of life or season of ministry experience when going to an assessment that makes the most sense? In terms of age, no. We've assessed all ages, and actually lots of second career folks as well. I would say there is a little bit more optimal ministry experience, because we do need some ministry experience so that we have some measurables to assess. If somebody has gone to college and from college gone to seminary, and then from seminary wants to be their first ministry experience as a church planter, it's going to be tough to have good measurables on them to make a solid recommendation. So it is helpful for them to have some church and ministry experience, so that we have things that we can measure in terms of the calling, character, and competency. David from South Carolina, just because I know David, he asked, what's the shelf life of an assessment? It's long, especially if somebody has been potentially recommended, which means they fall in the probably needs 3 to 5 years of seasoning or that ministry or life experience in order to comfortably move forward with church planting. What I'd recommend is, if you're working with somebody like that, to ask them for their final assessment summary, so that you can see what the recommendation of the assessment center was, their strengths and weaknesses, and see how they've progressed, and have they followed through with some of those things that needed some help. Can they hit the curveball and hit off the cutoff man now? And then the sending agency can make that judgment and feel more comfortable. But you have, if they have been assessed, they do have an assessment, and it's spelled out in quite detail. And so however long that's been, compare them today from that assessment summary in the past, and that will give you enough information to move forward.
Thanks. Well, good. Well, any other thoughts or questions as we wrap up?
I loved Jenny Dorsey's comment, who's been an assessor many years, church planter spouse in a church renewal situation right now as well. She just, in a longtime coach and leader with Pericoleo, she just said this. She remembers this quote, and it's been so helpful to me. We tend to make the seeds of our own destruction. We tend to take the seeds of our own destruction into our next ministry settings. Assessors help you see these potential blind spots so that you can avoid future ministry struggles. And I think it is this place of grace and love and encouragement to help us see things that many times positive things we can't see about our giftings or the way others relate to us, and sometimes challenging things that we need to take before the Lord and get help with, to get coaching with, to get counsel with. Mm-hmm. So I love Jenny's quote there.
Well, very good. Well, to wrap it up, just want to thank you all for being with us today, both the panel and the attendees. If you have any questions, do feel free to follow up. But assessment is nothing without being bathed in prayer. So the shameless plug then for tomorrow. Join tomorrow on MNA assessment with John Schmidt and Paul in that context, talking more about how to qualify to pray for your neighbor and nation. If you want a church plant, you better be engaged in that already. So with that, I want to thank you all. I appreciate your time. We'll be back on On the 4th, with that one, talking about interim pastors, how to help a church transition from perhaps a church planter who's been there for years or a long-term pastor to move on to the next one. What would it be like to have an interim in place? So join us then. Appreciate your being with us. Lord bless.